Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
On this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship, I am really excited to have the opportunity to interview Sean Speer, who is editor at large at The Hub. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about the future of media. And the media landscape is continuing to change rapidly, both in Canada and around the world. And The Hub is pioneering a new model of media that has gained a significant audience in Canada in the last few years. And it's very different than a lot of the traditional media that we think of in terms of local newspapers and things that have existed for a long time. And really excited to dive in with Sean on this important topic. Sean, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm a big fan of Venture for Canada and the work that you do, including the podcast. And so it's great to be part of this conversation.
Likewise, it's a pleasure to interview you. And I'm a big fan of the Hub as well. I think the content you put out is fantastic, and it fills a real gap in the Canadian landscape. So to dive in and get things started, Sean, what is the Hub?
Um, the Hub is which listeners and viewers can find at www.thehub.ca, is a news and commentary website focused primarily on Canadian public policy and current affairs. We publish a combination of opinion commentary, some standard reporting, and a series of podcasts. I think it's fair to say that the editorial positioning of the Hub is what one might describe as conservative or center right. By way of background, I previously worked for conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper and have subsequently spent time at various center right or market oriented think tanks. That said, I'd add a couple of points. First of all, we've really sought to model a type of public engagement and public commentary, particularly a conservative form that seeks to be civil, respectful, pragmatic, a bit humble about the different issues and challenges facing the country and our capacity to respond to them. Second, I think we are living in an exciting period of intellectual heterodoxy. There are this week, as a matter of fact, we're speaking on April 3rd. Marco Rubio, the well-known Republican senator from Florida, was in the Washington Post arguing for industrial policy, not something typically associated with free market conservatism. There are debates on the right on issues of foreign policy, domestic policy, and so on. And so, in that sense, we're pretty ecumenical. We platform a lot of different ideas and voices, all with the goal of trying to help our audience work through a lot of big issues facing the country, including, I think, issues that would be of interest to you and your audience, and such as declining new business startups in the country, flatline or declining business investment, issues around labor productivity, and of course living standards, which has really been a top issue at the Hub over the past several months, and we're happy to see break into the broader political and policy conversation. So that's a very long way of saying uh, we've been at it for now 3 years, and we like to think that we are making a useful contribution to the public discourse concerning issues of policy and politics in Canada.
One of the things that we love to dive into at Venture for Canada are founding stories. So, Sean, can you describe a little bit what was the genesis like? How did the idea for the Hub come to be? And what was that first couple of months like in terms of bringing the Hub into reality?
Well, it's funny when you asked to speak to me. I thought I was a funny fit because I don't sort of think of myself as entrepreneurial. As I mentioned, I've worked in politics and think tanks and universities. But as I started to think about it, the Hub is, of course, in a lot of ways, a startup. It's not a business startup in a conventional sense, but we've had to do a lot of things to stand up the hub and start to grow that startups in more conventional parts of the economy would have to. By way of background, I'm a co-founder of the hub along with my partner Rudyard Griffiths, who may be familiar to some of your audience members as the chair of the Monk Debates, the highly successful um, debate program held at Roy Thompson Hall in Toronto. Now, I think approaching something like a decade of debates. Him and I were lamenting in and around 2019 um, both the kind of state of media and public commentary in Canada, but as importantly, what we saw as a kind of declining intellectual rootedness on the part of conservatism. That was particularly uh, uh, paramount in the United States when, of course, we were in the midst of the first Trump administration. But we had some concerns that some of those pathologies were starting to make their way to Canada, and we wanted to establish uh, a news and commentary platform that would sort of push back against those trends, that would try to bring expression to intellectually rooted ideas and arguments about public policy, primarily, as I said earlier, from a center right or conservative point of view. So, having conceived of the market gap we were trying to fill or the problem we were trying to solve, the question, of course, is how do you go about doing that? Just in brief, uh, the hub. Was initially generously supported by a small number of philanthropic foundations. So we haven't, up until the present, been fully subjected to a market test. That is to say, we haven't been fully reliant on advertising or sponsorships or subscriptions to support our work. Although that's changing, and I can talk a bit about that if you're interested. But with the support of a small number of philanthropic foundations interested in issues of public policy and politics. Some that your audience might be familiar with, including the Donner Canadian Foundation, which has long supported a major book prize in Canada. We were able to get off the ground in April 2021. So I mentioned we're speaking on the 3rd of April. Next week will mark the third anniversary of the hub and the kickoff of our fourth full year in publication. Um, and I won't bore you with details, but from I from conception in 2019 when Rudyard and I were talking about the need and potential for something like this until that launch date, a lot had to happen, and everything from the obvious fundraising to conceptualizing editorial position and a mix of editorial content to building the website. We're a digital only news platform to staffing up and then beginning to make some judgments about both our audience and our key performance indicators, as well as well as how we saw ourselves fitting into the market. And I guess I'll just wrap up here, Scott, by saying as we end year three, and I look back at that 18 months or so of the conceptualization and execution stage to get to a place where we could launch on April 12th, 2021. It's shocking to me uh, how we got a lot of big things right, but how many things we actually got wrong. To give you one example, um, we conceived of the hub uh, at a time when, in the midst of the pandemic, you'll probably remember, and this will resonate with listeners, that newsletters were very popular. A lot of people were launching newsletters. We sort of envisioned the newsletter being a principal means by which we would communicate our content to our audience and disseminate it more broadly. We thought the newsletter itself represented a kind of key value proposition for the hub, and now, uh, 3 years into it, our newsletter is valuable. It's a good way to enable a kind of two-way conversation between the hub and its core readers. But I think we're not the only outlet in the English speaking press that it's experienced something of a kind of stagnation when it comes to the use of newsletters as a kind of key means of conveying and disseminating news and commentary. And in that sense, our website, in a way, and social media channels have proven to be more important than we initially conceived. So I could go on and on, but I suspect if there's a kind of universal insight that would resonate with startup founders in other parts of the economy, it's that um, we spent a lot of time getting some of the big foundational parts of the project right. Who are we? What do we want to achieve? How will we how will we think of ourselves and communicate about ourselves? All of that is broadly held up, but how we've gone about doing it, oh my goodness, so much has changed. So much has been through this process of trial and error over the hub's first 3 years.
Beyond the newsletter point, which is fascinating, by the way, I wasn't aware of the extent to which the email newsletters have become kind of less effective. What are some of the ways that the hub today in April 2024 is different than what you would have expected it to have looked like when you first were envisioning the idea?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm proud to say one of the most important is we're bigger. That our traffic and engagement at this point, I think it's fair to say, is higher than I would have anticipated in 2021. Um, w- in March 2024, so just last month, we exceeded 500,000 page views for the first time, which puts us in a place where we are one of the largest digital only news organizations in the country, and quite a bit bigger, on par, or quite a bit bigger than some familiar ones. In February, for instance, our web traffic exceeded the McLean's page. So so I'm proud to say that um, my instinctive reaction is one thing that's different is we've just or one way in which things have proceeded differently than I would have anticipated is we've grown faster. That's the easy answer. The tougher answer is a few different things. It's been harder to get people to give us money. That In today's media market, Scott, the there's a delta between the growth in your audience and the growth in your subscriber or reader revenues, that people have been socialized over the past 20 years or so to expect or to anticipate online news content to be free. That goes back to a decision that the traditional media made uh, in the early onset of the internet not to gate their content, and that has kind of shaped consumer patterns. So I think uh, in the old days of the media, there was almost like a one-to-one relationship between the growth of your audience and the growth of your revenue. That's not the case in today's market, when there's sort of zero marginal cost for the growth of an audience member or a reader, or someone who engages our social media content, but not necessarily the growth in own source revenue. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we create more of a relationship with our audience members, such that they don't just come to the site or sign up for the free newsletter, all of which is great and we're enormously grateful, but they kind of cross that threshold and decide to give us their credit card number. So that's one thing that has one outcome that's a little different than we might have anticipated. I mentioned the newsletter one. Um, a couple of others that might be of interest uh, to the audience. Um, Social media, that we might even get into this over the course of the conversation. That there's been a lot of attention on the social media platforms, Meta and X and Google, and the accusation made by a lot of traditional outlets that they are, that their dominance in the online advertising market has has been detrimental to the industry, and therefore, as outlined in Bill C-18, the platforms ought to be mandated to provide effective compensation to the sector. Um, we started with zero audience, and we've stood up a platform, and within 3 years, we'll have done about 4 million page views this year, more than 2.5 million unique users. We couldn't have built those audiences from scratch without the power of the online platforms. That they, whatever one thinks about their strengths and weaknesses, they do have a kind of extraordinary capacity for an outlet like ours or any type of business to identify the types of people who may be interested in your product, if I can call it that, and put that product before them. Our cost per click, which is a major underlying feature of our business, are reaching levels that we couldn't have been anticipated when we launched, and that's a key part of what's fueled our growth over the past 3 years. So those are just some of the considerations that um, that have caused us to sort of rethink parts of our initial plan when we launched the hub back in 2021.
First off, congrats on that growth. That is so impressive. Half a million page views in a month is no small feat, especially in the context of Canada. And I think you said 2.5 million unique visitors over the course of a year is also tremendous. Like, and to your point, exceeds a lot of like traditional kind of news media in Canada. And I think is a testament to how innovative approaches to news media can, with a lot of hard work and creativity and strategic thinking, reach a immense amount of people in a way that 30 years ago would have been so much harder to have done. To zero in on one thing that you were talking about, which is that sort of revenue diversification or growth of like own sourced revenues. As you look to the next kind of couple of years and kind of growing that diversity, so the own source revenues is also an increasingly significant source of the revenue mix. What do you view as the principal kind of strategies that the hub can pursue to grow the amount of own source revenues?
Yeah, I think one of the conclusions that we've reached after 3 years is that subscriber revenues, that is, contributions from our readers, will grow organically over time, and I don't want to diminish it. This year we'll do close to $100,000 in reader provided resources, which is tremendous, both in terms of the resource and capacity that it grants us, but also the extent to which it provides almost like a market mechanism that it's a signal to us um, from our readers about what they like and what they don't like. But we're also pretty clear eyed that revenue source. Well, we have some ambitions about its growth. There are probably going to be some inherent limits. That is to say, it'll never be a sort of foundational source of revenue for us. And so we've shifted a little bit over the past 12 or 18 months to start to draw on alternative sources of revenue. We've done some advertising. We tried to and we've tried to keep it um, somewhat limited, not gratuitous. We don't want a bunch of pop-ups and so on that come at the expense of user experience. We also don't want to make a bunch of compromises in terms of the kind of editorial positioning of the hub and our advertising partners. So we've been pretty selective. But I think for those listeners who are hub readers or listeners, you'll probably start to see more of a presence of banner ads on our website or advertising in our podcasts. We've also had some success, Scott, and here is an area where I do see the potential for pretty considerable growth in what I would describe as sponsored content. We've decided that we won't do what's sometimes described as advertorial content, so we won't have content that sort of talks up a company or a CEO or something like that in a way that may obscure for the reader whether it's straight up content or whether it's content that has been sponsored by some type of partner. Instead, we've tried to work with partners who have public policy interests or issues that broadly align with ours and are interested in using the platform as a way to as a kind of entry point into those issues. So just you know, just as an example, we've run since November 2023 a program along with Meta on the subject of the future of journalism. It's involved a combination of podcast episodes, of opinion commentary, and some standard reporting looking at different business models in today's media market in Canada, the US, and the UK. All of that content is marked, supported by Meta, so there's no confusion on the part of readers or listeners. But I can say that Meta supported the broad contours of the project. Thereafter, implementation has been fully controlled by us. We've not shared, for instance, any content in the advance of regular publication, and so we think that that may be a model moving forward where we can work with partners who, as I say, have kind of broadly similar views on different public policy issues and build sponsorship opportunities. In a perfect world, those sponsorship enable us to produce content that we sort of want to produce anyway, and the consequences for the hub listener reader, there's virtually no, it's almost indiscernible from the point of view of the quality of the content um and the ideas laid out in the content between sponsored content and our regular content. If we can keep that up, I think we can not only start to generate more revenue through that model, but also bring kind of new and different content to our audience.
It's fascinating. One thing that comes to mind, which didn't come up in your answer, is like events. I know a lot of media companies, events have become a huge part of the revenue mix. And certainly, I would find it interesting to attend like a hub conference or hub events that you host in different places. To what extent are you thinking of events as a revenue strategy?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So we are going to be doing carrying out a seminar series in year 4 of our publication, which kicks off in earnest next week. I would say though that we don't envision those seminars as revenue generators in and of themselves. It kind of comes back to something I was saying earlier. We've spent a lot of time, including doing some surveys of our audience, to figure out what it would take for readers, including those who currently subscribe to our free membership, to feel a sense of community and kind of investment in the hub, such that they'd consider making a financial contribution. We called the hub with some intentionality. We sort of saw it as um, something that connected um, like-minded people or people with similar interests across the country, that connected ideas and policy and politics and so on. And I would say, one, if there's been one failing of the hub in the first 3 years, is we haven't quite created those conditions yet. If I was being defensive, I would say part of that was we launched in the pandemic. Part of it is we've been so focused on getting the content and the platform and so on right. But I think it is fair to say it's a fair criticism, that at present the sort of value to a financial contributor isn't is the value, besides just supporting the work that we do, the incremental value isn't totally self-evident. And so one thing we'd like to do, through these seminars and other activities, possibly book clubs and this sort of thing, is to try to create that sense of community so that people aren't just reading the newsletter or listening to podcasts or coming to the site. They actually do feel a sort of investment in the hub, that they feel like they belong to a community, and that ultimately is the best way to convince them that it's worth making a financial contribution to becoming a supporter. And in that sense, we see events as a key part of that kind of community building project.
Yeah, I can relate. At Venture for Canada, we do things called community roundtables, and we'll do like 15 of them across the country. And they're both really fun events, and they're themed around different topics, but they're also a great way of how we engage people across the country from St. John's to Vancouver,
Oh,
and engaging our community, and be a lot of positive feedback, and engages people in a lot of ways to give back to the organization,
mm,
longer term. One thing to zoom in on it is, entrepreneurs address market gaps. They propose solutions and addressing gaps in the market. And you mentioned earlier your concern in terms of essentially what you're saying is like the need for like center right kind of like voices in the landscape, in the context of the era of Trump, but also looking at what people describe as like mainstream media or like traditional media. A common critique in Canada and the United States and other places in the world is that the mainstream media can be biased against conservative views, or that conservative views don't show up in the mainstream media. Certainly, you hear this a lot in the United States. You also hear this in the kind of Canadian context, I would say, increasingly. So I guess, Sean, a question to you is, to what extent do you feel that the mainstream or traditional media isn't sufficiently kind of voicing center right or kind of conservative perspectives?
yeah, I think there's certainly some of that, and it was part of the mix of things that we were thinking about when we launched. That is to say, that we sort of bet that there was an untapped market out there interested in center right ideas, particularly as they relate to issues of public policy and politics. But I wouldn't say that that was a central factor. I think of the National Post, which does a pretty good job. There are various other outlets that purport to speak on behalf of conservative ideas. I, I think I think that. Well, let me say a couple of things directly in response, and then maybe one bigger picture point, which may interest you and your audience. I think, first, as I said earlier, we really wanted to try to model uh, a, a type of intellectually rooted, intellectually rigorous conservatism that our concern, as I said, was that some of the excesses of conservative populism that we've seen play out in the US, the UK, and elsewhere were starting to find kind of resonance in Canada, and we wanted to model, what we see as a different, better way. And in that sense, we've called out cases of conservative excess in Canada, even the extent to which that's come at some negative reaction from our audience. I mentioned my co-founder Rudyard Griffiths. He wrote a piece for us in 2022 condemning conspiratorial thinking on the right with respect to the World Economic Forum. For instance, I wrote a piece in the immediate aftermath of Jason Kenney's sacking in the province of Alberta about what I saw as some destructive tendencies on the right, and there have been various other instances where we've been prepared to kind of police our own side, if I can put it that way, that we think is important to us and our identity. The second thing I'd say, with respect to the market gap that we were looking to solve, is that we saw the hub as an opportunity to bring new and different voices into the public conversation. So, one of the consequences of stagnation in traditional media over the past several years is that there's almost been like this generation, this like misgeneration in terms of the voices that one finds on, say, a comment page of the National Post or the Globe and Mail. Like, they're just not hiring columnists anymore. And so a lot of those outlets have good people who I've grown up reading and who've had an intellectual influence on me, but who just feel a bit dated and stale and a bit out of touch with a lot of the issues animating younger Canadians. And so we've been really proud at the hub that we've been able to regularly bring new and different voices to the platform. Before we got started recording, you mentioned a highly successful piece that we published earlier this year by Toronto-based policy commentator named Eric Lombardi, who 5 or 10 years ago, before the kind of democratization of journalism as a result of the proliferation of online and outlets, may not have found a voice in the public conversation. He may have been gatekept, if I can use that phrase or term, by the traditional outlets. So that's something we thought about from the start and something we've been proud to do. If I could step back though, bigger picture, because I know you have a business audience that thinks about these things through an entrepreneurial lens, even more so than I do, as someone whose background is principally public policy. One of the main advantages that the hub has relative to traditional outlets is we don't have all of the traditional fixed costs that they have. We don't have, we don't have printing presses and unionized employees and physical assets spread across the country and legacy pension costs and all the rest. Like, we've been in effect able to take the parts of journalism that for which there remains a market and for which we believe can ultimately be profitable without being held back by all of those legacy costs that are something of a burden on the backs of the traditional outlets. That that financial flexibility, the fact that we've started organizationally as a clean slate, um, it may not be a kind of market gap that we're filling per se, but it's an enormous comparative advantage um, relative to the major outlets. And it sort of prompts a bigger conversation, which I'm happy to have if you're interested, about various efforts on the part of the federal government for which reasonable people can agree or disagree to try to support the traditional outlets in a way. One of the, in my mind, inherent flaws is that with those subsidies is they're not addressing what in my mind are the kind of structural impediments to those outlets uh, returning to growth. It's that it's these legacy costs that remain a huge burden. I appeared before a parliamentary committee, uh, uh, I guess late last year, on these very subjects, and a member of parliament said, "But isn't it important that we continue to have daily print newspapers?" And I just thought, like, maybe, maybe not. I don't know, but I'm not sure that that's ought to be a priority for public policy. Uh, Surely public policy ought to try to create the conditions for different models of journalism to experiment and test the market and iterate, as opposed to say it is a national priority that we continue to have people receiving newspapers on their porch every morning at 5 a.m. Like, I think, in fact, in a way, I guess, just to close the point, that if policymaking or frankly business thinking starts with those types of premises, um, it's locking the traditional outlets into a model that in which those legacy costs will continue to constrain them.
It's fitting that we're doing this interview today because, as we were talking about in the pre taping, Saltwire, which owns most of the newspapers in Atlantic Canada, recently filed for bankruptcy with, I think, $94 million of debt. I grew up in Nova Scotia. Chronicle Herald is the kind of original name for Saltwire. By the way, I think the name Saltwire is like horrible. I don't know how they came into that branding, but clearly there were bigger business mistakes that were made at different points. If they owe $94 million of debt, what kind of the first question I have for you, and you touched about this in your most recent response, is like, beyond those kind of like fixed costs that exist in a lot of like traditional kind of like media. What are some of the main kind of tailwinds that are kind of holding traditional media back? And a sort of second follow up question is, there are some traditional media, like particularly in the U.S., like New York Times, publicly traded company, making a big profit. Its quarterly statements, it's continuing to grow. New York Times is in pretty strong financial footing. And there's others, around the world, British newspapers that have continued to do pretty well on a financial level. So, yeah, what are the tailwinds facing traditional media, and how can traditional media potentially still thrive in our current era?
That's a big question. And I feel a bit self conscious answering it because there's a lot of people who've been thinking about these issues longer and more deeply than me who are working through them. So, as long as listeners uh, take what I'm about to say with those caveats, I think there's a couple of big challenges facing the sector. The first is decline of advertising, which is self-evident. That for most of the 20th century, traditional outlets uh, relied on advertising to essentially subsidize news production, and in that context, they were, by all accounts, kind of flushed with cash. The arrival of successful online digital advertising models, including Facebook and Google, have really disrupted that market and those revenues, and left a pretty big gaping hole in the balance sheets of a lot of traditional outlets. The second is something I mentioned earlier, which is um, uh, up until now, and in part, frankly, because of the traditional success of the advertising model, they never really relied on readers to pay for their content. There's always been a gap between audience size and reader-driven revenues. That has only grown in a way in the internet age because, as I said earlier, a decision was taken by most outlets at the advent of the internet not to gate their content, to effectively produce it publicly for free. And they're now trying to kind of put the toothpaste back in the tube and start to socialize people to that news is a valuable product for which they ought to ascribe a financial value. Um, Looking forward, I think um, different outlets are pursuing kind of different models. You mentioned the New York Times. I think one of the consequences of the internet, which is hardly limited to news media, I think it extends to a lots of other parts of the economy, and particularly in different cultural industries, is that um, two things are happening. One is an era of fragmentation. So there's no longer a paper of record per se. There are lots of different outlets doing lots of different things, and people are able to find quite a more customized, bespoke experience as a news and information consumer. And in that sense, large, kind of comprehensive outlets like a major daily newspaper have just found it harder to compete. The second thing, though, which is sort of uh, may sound in conflict with the notion of fragmentation, is we also have a global market. And so I think if you're a really successful outlet like the New York Times, you no longer have to think of your audience as the city of New York, or frankly even the American market. It is now a truly global news outlet, and so there's a kind of winner take all almost dynamic that's caused by that. um, I had on our podcast, Hub Dialogues, late last year, um, the former editor of the Washington Post, who talked about Jeff Bezos buying the newspaper and saying, this isn't a Washington outlet. This is a global outlet, and we need to start kind of conceptualizing ourselves um, that way. So the combination of winner take all in a global market, combined with this new era of fragmentation, is putting a lot of pressure on traditional outlets who are already facing these revenue challenges that stem from the decline of advertising, and the challenges that they've faced persuading readers to fund them. Uh, Let me just make one point though before I stop rambling at you, and I've used the language of fragmentation and democratization a couple of times so far in the conversation. I think it's worth unpacking that a little bit, because listeners may instinctively have concerns about what's happening in the news media industry. They're confronted virtually every day with stories of layoffs and bankruptcies, and so consolidation and bankruptcies and so on. And I don't diminish any of that. One would be disingenuous if you said that the sector isn't facing a kind of a challenging period. Um, but as entrepreneurs, your network understands that Schumpeter's notion of creative destruction has a destructive side, but it also has the creative side. And I often feel it often feels like our discussions about the state of the news media in Canada, or maybe even more broadly, focuses primarily on the destructive side and diminishes the constructive side. Um, I may, if I could digress for 1 second, say part of me sometimes wonders if it's because the principal way we hear about these things is through the news media. But
Yeah.
I'll set that aside. I actually think that there is some really exciting things happening in the new in the creative part of the market. A lot of models aren't working. They themselves are being tested and failing. There are ongoing questions about scalability and all the rest. So I don't want to diminish them, but if you're prepared to look beyond the destructive part of the creative destructive equation and see some of the creativity, I suspect a lot of your audience members are receive the Peak newsletter, which last year sold out for $5 million after building a good product that people wanted, and that ended up having quite a significant valuation. I get my sports content from The Athletic, which is just doing really tremendous sports reporting and analysis that you wouldn't have found in traditional outlets. And a couple of years ago, was bought out by the New York Times. We've been profiling at the Hub for the past several weeks. Really exciting community projects in Calgary or a neighborhood in the city of Toronto, to bigger, more heterodox platforms like Unheard in the UK. I mean, I could go on and on. But I guess if I would sort of make one key point here is, notwithstanding the tailwinds that you mentioned earlier, which are significant and shouldn't be diminished. If there was any audience that was going to instinctively understand that we can't merely focus on the destructive part, that we ought to also pay attention to the creative part, it would be your audience as a group of entrepreneurs. And if you start to think that way, it has implications not just for the way individual consumers think about the state of the news media in Canada, but it would also have an influence on the role of public policy. Like, so much public policy right now as it relates to the sector, including the raft of subsidies that the government has rolled out, as well as Bill C-18, which I mentioned earlier, mandated the major online advertising platforms to provide compensation to the sector, really starts from a destruction mindset. But I think if policymakers shifted their thinking, to at least understand the the kind of symbiotic nature between creative creation and destruction, and even sort of tilted their attention more to what's the creative things that are happening in the economy and in the sector, I think it would produce a different set of policy outcomes.
Yeah, sometimes the conversations on like the decline of traditional media is this nostalgia, I think, for the past. And sometimes there's certain aspects of the traditional media where I'm like, maybe I'm not necessarily sad that it's gone. I remember growing up as a kid in Nova Scotia, Chronicle Herald, the nickname people would always call it is like the Chronicle Horrid, because it was like not necessarily very good content, to be honest. And it's been kind of supplanted by All Nova Scotia, which is subscriber based, has expanded to all these other parts of the country. And All Nova Scotia is like a really
Example.
sustainable and financially successful like media model that is really successful in like Saskatchewan now too.
And may I
Uh,
just say, at the risk of interrupting, I'm sorry. I'm normally a podcast host, so I can't resist the temptation as a guest. Is I mentioned that the Hub has some center right dispositions, and I recognize that those dispositions may not be shared by your entire audience. Reasonable people can agree or disagree about policy and politics, but I mentioned, I use the word democratization and gatekeeping intentionally. In the old pre-fragmented, highly consolidated marketplace, yes, all of us got our news from the same sources, and that meant there was, ostensibly more cohesion, or whatever. Um, but it was also an era in which women and other visible minorities were less present in the news media. The barriers to entry for different opinions or different points of view were much higher. In which essentially a small number of outlets, a controlled uh the story of ourselves, a story of our country. And as you say, I think there can be a kind of a tendency towards nostalgia, that people miss that we don't sit around and listen to Walter Cronkite or whatever over dinner. But I think it's impossible not to see that today's market, notwithstanding some of the inherent challenges, is just much more inclusive, much more dynamic, um, you know, much more competitive, which as entrepreneurs, I suspect a lot of your listeners would understand, has a kind of positive impact on quality and and encourages a kind of a pursuit of excellence. Like I do think that I do think that sort of breaking open the market, um, well, it's producing a kind of a period of destabilization, will ultimately be net good, when it comes to the kind of representativeness and the quality of news journalism in Canada and elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, in short, the decline of traditional media isn't necessarily always a bad thing. That being said, like, is local journalism important? I think that it is. I think that there's different ways that local journalism can exist. I'm thinking of a guy in Hamilton, Joey. I'm forgetting his last name, but he's like a citizen reporter. He was a fellow at Massey Hall for a year for like a recognition of like, and it's just this one guy who just is so focused on Hamilton, Ontario, and devotes his like life to like covering city politics. And he's not like he's a one person shop, but he has a huge reach in Hamilton, and he also has a little bit more independence to kind of say what he thinks. And as a maybe a kind of closing point is, it's interesting the rise of Substack, which I'm sure is something you're probably thinking a lot about. And Substack probably is a kind of director, like, or people on Substack are kind of direct or indirect kind of competitors. But as you were talking, I was thinking of like Paul Wells, who, he's still connected, he's still commenter on CBC and things. But I wonder, if, to ask him, hey, now that you have this independence of Substack, can he say certain things or do certain things, or write certain things, that he would maybe not do if it was on traditional media? And how does that potentially benefit?
Well, there's that, of course, which is almost undoubtedly true. But to come back to my point about the legacy costs, I mean, in a way, Paul Wells is a good example, because Paul Wells, if you think about it, was effectively subsidizing Maclean's. He was his writing, which was a major reason that people were subscribing to the magazine, was subsidizing the kind of legacy costs of the magazine. And by going out on his own, he's essentially kind of monetized himself. And I suspect he's um, he's working less and making more, because he's not sharing the revenues with printing presses and unionized employees and physical properties and all the rest. And so I do think that uh, I do think that the kind of inherent economics of the industry point in a direction in which there's ultimately a sustainable business model out there. I believe it after 3 years at the Hub. I do think that news, that claims that we are going to enter a sort of news Armageddon are overstated. But it is going to look and feel a bit different than it historically has. And what's a bit funny is that in other parts of the economy, we're reconciled to that. That no one sort of expects that different industries must look and feel and do things the same way as they've always done. But for some reason, that's the kind of mindset that guides a lot of policy thinking when it comes to the news media. And I think I think it misreads the market. It overlooks some of the creativity and innovation that's happening, and I guess most importantly, it actually risks impeding that progress by sort of locking in place the traditional institutions and the kind of underlying structural challenges that they face. And so, in that sense, I think news media. I started by saying that I didn't sort of think of myself as an entrepreneur, and I still don't, especially relative to the kind of true entrepreneurs that are part of Venture for Canada and no doubt make up much of your listening audience. But I do think the industry needs that entrepreneurial um, mindset and entrepreneurial spirit. And I think with it, we can come out the other side of this period of creative destruction with a new and different and better uh, model for news and information in our society.
Agreed. I think you look at Paul Wells, and to your point, he probably definitely is making way more money. I subscribe and I pay, I think, $50 a year, and I think that he has 20,000 plus subscribers. So if you add that up, it's a pretty large salary if it's just him. So I think it's a testament to the fact though that there's a like particularly when you built that audience, and maybe it is a little bit of a winners take all. There can't be a ton of different Paul Wells who are getting that many people to pay $50 kind of a year. But there's a greater diversity of voices, and there's a greater freedom of expression. That being said, I think that there's some loss of probably journalism at the local level, which I do think is a real thing. But I think it's there's also the opportunity for citizen journalists, at a local level to make an impact as well. Sean, to kind of close things off, is there anything that we didn't kind of talk about in the interview that you're interested in kind of leaving as final words for the listeners?
Uh, no, I don't think so. I admire Venture for Canada and what it stands for, and the people who comprise it, and um, I think in today's economy, um, we need more of Venture for Canada and less of the uh, and less of the kind of traditional way of thinking of business and industry in the country, and that extends to the news media industry. And so, in that sense, I'd encourage people to check us out. It's www.thehub.ca. Our podcasts are on all the various platforms at Hub Podcasts. You won't agree with everything you read or listen to. I wouldn't want you to, but hopefully it leaves you um, intrigued, interested, and better informed.
And I would definitely recommend listeners check out the Hub, regardless of your political views. I think that the Hub has a great ideas and actually quite diversity of like thinkers, like within the context of the platform. So, regardless of how you think, I recommend you check it out. And a great source for news and opinion and content. Sean, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It was a true pleasure speaking with you.
The pleasure's mine. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.